Pilar Marrero.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Good morning. I speak for all the reporters on the line. I know everyone's exhausted. I don't know if you are, but I am. Raise your hand. But we have had, I think journalism has, and most journalism, has actually done its job this week.
And by this, I mean that there is no other block of voters in the country of this size and of this with this amount of electoral power that behaves in the way that the Black American electorate does for this long. For nearly 6 decades, about 90% of Black Americans have voted for the Democratic candidate for president and for congressional elections. And this follows a long history ever since the end of the Civil War, where Black voters, to the extent that they were enfranchised, more times than not, lumped themselves on one side of our two-party system as a way of exercising their electoral power through racial solidarity and also combating racism that often clustered itself in the other party. And so the participation of Black Americans in American politics has often been a way of furthering civil rights and of protecting against either overt racism or racial conservatism put in other ways. And so what we saw this year is what we expected to see. From 1964 to 2004, the Black Americans have voted, look, frankly, from 1964 to this year, about 90% of Black Americans have supported Democratic candidates. Now, there was an uptick in that the years that Barack Obama ran for the presidency in 2008 and 2012. This year, what we saw from exit polls, and the exit polls that I use are from the AP VoteCast, which showed that 90% of Black Americans supported Joe Biden and 8% of Black Americans supported Donald Trump. This looks exactly like 2016, when about 89% of Black Americans voted for Hillary Clinton and about 8% of Black Americans supported Donald Trump. There is a gender gap among Black Americans, as there are with every other race and ethnicity. The first one is the one that's most common, and it's between men and women. In Black America in 2016, the turnout rate for Black women was 10% higher than it was for Black men. And I expect once the numbers are crunched for this election, we'll see the same thing. Additionally, Black men are more likely to support Republican candidates, and that includes Donald Trump, than Black women are. In 2016, 4% of Black women supported Donald Trump compared to 13% of Black men. This year, 6% of Black women supported Donald Trump compared to 12% of Black men. And so the gap actually shrunk this year from where it was in 2016. Here's the other thing about Black voting behavior. From 1964 to 2004, about 11-ish% of Black Americans supported Republican Party candidates. And then, of course, that dipped in 2008 and 2012 when Barack Obama was on the ticket. It dipped down to 4% and then to 6%. And then it rebounded a little bit in 2016 where Donald Trump got 8%, as I mentioned. But what this tells us is that Donald Trump actually performed every other Republican presidential candidate going back to 1964 with Black voters. And even as he talked about the gains he made in the Platinum Plan and HBCU funding and low unemployment rates and criminal justice reform, none of those policy appeals moved Black voters. The increase that we saw in Donald Trump's 2016 victory and his output this year is mostly attributed to Black Republicans who decided they wanted to support the first Black president, who happened to be a Democrat in 2008 and 2012, coming back home to the Republican Party in 2016 and 2020. And to some extent, those who sat out elections previously got re-engaged. So that sort of explains a little bit of the partisan breakdown. But we know that the presidential election, no matter really writ large, no matter race, group, et cetera, the winner of the election is the side that does a better job of getting their voters to the polls. The Knight Foundation study from a few years ago suggested that of the 100 million Americans that sit out elections, they are basically evenly divided between those who lean Democrat and those who lean Republican, which is to say non-voters in the United States look just like voters in the United States in terms of their political ideology. So expanding the access to the ballot does not advantage any one party over another. And the only way a party can get an advantage from a high or low turnout is who decides to stay home and not participate. And the side, again, that does a better job of getting their people to the poll win. We are seeing it this year. Record turnout, the highest turnout in 120 years, and this thing is razor thin close. If you take California, the popular vote disparity in California, this year it's over 4 million votes, 2016 it's over 4 million votes. You basically get a popular vote that is really, really close in the other 49 states, which is to say we are a nation that is about evenly divided between the parties. Normally that's not a problem, but in a hyper-partisan environment, it is a problem. And where the anomalies are is really with African Americans who, again, cluster themselves in the one party. The reason for the Joe Biden support from African American voters this year is more about investing their electoral power in the Democratic candidate they believed had the best shot at beating Donald Trump. And while a lot of the analysis during the primary system suggested that Kamala Harris or Cory Booker would have the inside track with Black voters because of that descriptive representation, we quickly learned as soon as Black voters got a chance to weigh in the primary in South Carolina and Super Tuesday that wasn't the fact. That wasn't true. In fact, Black voters were more pragmatic, looking to the candidate they
today. So I just wanted to express my gratitude. Let me talk about how immigration showed up. We all know that when Donald Trump came down that escalator in 2015, the original sin of Trumpism was xenophobia. He demonized immigrants from the first time he spoke, and it became the signature issue for this administration. And he and his White House aide, Stephen Miller, have taken a wrecking ball to our immigration and refugee system. And it's been the defining issue of this administration. They thought, because in 2016 they thought it helped them win, that by emphasizing it as much as they did, it would create a political majority on the back of racism and xenophobia. Today we can say that their reliance on racism and xenophobia has failed. Indeed, I would argue that it's backfired. And what happened? You saw it in 2018. Remember, Trump nationalized the midterm race, talking about caravans and criminals, and with using language that incited racism, unlike we've seen in American politics recently, and it failed. Massive turnout, massive rejection of Republicans, and the Democrats took the House. In 2020, Trump was at it again. It was more the anti-Black racism than the anti-immigrant xenophobia, but he did both. If you listen to his speeches, he was accusing Somalis of being terrorists and Mexicans of being bad hombres and the rest of it. But the fact is that Americans rejected this. This is an old politics. It didn't start with Donald Trump. In the politics business, it's a wedge issue. It's an issue that divides and demoralizes your opponents, and it scrapes off centrist voters who are uncomfortable by the fear that's generated by the attacks. Immigration has been a wedge issue that Republicans have wielded for 30 years. And in this election, it failed. In this election, it failed. The wedge of immigration is losing its edge. Why is it losing its edge? Because of public opinion, because of voter support, because of organizing in immigrant communities, because of progressives making immigration a top priority. So what you have now is an American public that was forced by Donald Trump and his extremism to choose. And they chose to come down on the side of refugees and immigrants. That is a very powerful statement. That is not a statement just of what candidates and politicians do. It's a statement of what a multiracial majority in America said through this election. They said, we want to be a welcoming country. We don't like Trump's separation of families. We don't like the idea that he could just close down immigration using the pandemic as cover. We don't like the idea of gutting asylum and turning people back who come to our shores seeking freedom. They don't like the policy of putting dreamers and TPSers on a pathway to citizenship. The fact is that this was in part a referendum on immigration. I see somebody saying, yeah, but a lot of people voted for Trump. Indeed, they did. Indeed, they did. And a bigger majority, a historic majority, voted against him. So when the defining issue of the man on the ballot, and when he goes down to defeat because a record number of Americans said no, that is the day that I'm going to celebrate. I have experienced immigration as a wedge issue for 30 years. On this side of this election, we can say that Americans were tested, they were forced to decide, and they chose. They chose on the side of America being a welcoming country. So I'm optimistic. I think we're going to be able to undo most of what Trump has done, move forward to build a new system. And it's not going to be easy because the Republicans are going to continue to try to divide and conquer through racism and xenophobia. But I think the American people are congealing in a majority and ready to move forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for your passion and your work. We certainly experienced this in California 25 years ago. We had elections led by racism and xenophobia, and the voters changed that. So California is now a very progressive state. We're going to move on to our third speaker, Dr. Stephen Nuño-Perez, Senior Analyst of Latino Decisions. Hi, Stephen. How are you?
Hi, Pilar. How's it going?
Good. And can you allow him to share his screen? You're going to share your screen with the
Yes, please.
slides? Okay.
Yeah.
Control room.
This should work. Let's see. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. First, thanks for inviting me here. This is an amazing time. Thanks to Frank and Ted. Especially when we're talking about what this means for our country. And one of the saddest things I think about Donald Trump is coming to some recognition or to some realization about who we are as a country. And perhaps, and what I tell my students is, now that we know, the test of our character is what we do now. And I think as we move forward, I think that's probably the most important thing in what's going to define who we are as a country and who we are as our neighbors. Because it hurts a little bit as a minority to know that your neighbors don't exactly see you as a human being. That said, this is a positive time. I think this is a time to celebrate, I think. And one of those things, as Ted was saying, is when we see how the black vote impacted Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and when we look at Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee, Atlanta, when you concentrate and when we look at motivated voters in these areas, it's very difficult to win an election in Georgia and Michigan when you mobilize black voters in Detroit. And moving out west, when we talk about Latinos, extremely difficult to win an election when you have mobilized minorities, Hispanics, Latinos in Phoenix, in Las Vegas, in Albuquerque, in Los Angeles. If you have these mobilized voters on election day, it's very difficult to win an election. I hope the lesson here over the next 2 years is that if